June 1944. The beaches of Normandy still burn with the smoke of victory. Allied troops have stormed ashore, broken through Hitler's Atlantic Wall, and opened the long-awaited Western Front. Yet, just days after the landings, a new kind of battle begins. One not fought with bullets or bombs, but with fuel, food, and time. Behind the thunder of tanks and the march of soldiers lies a growing problem: logistics. The Allied armies are moving faster than anyone ever planned. Towns fall one after another, roads are clogged with vehicles, and bridges are reduced to rubble. Every mile gained by the infantry pushes the supply lines farther from the beaches and closer to collapse. By late June, success itself has become a threat. The deeper the armies push into France, the longer and weaker the supply chain becomes. Fuel convoys crawl across cratered roads. Ammunition trucks sink into mud. What was supposed to be a smooth logistical operation turns into chaos. Supplies meant for frontline divisions pile up on Normandy's beaches. Thousands of tons of fuel drums, rations, spare parts, and artillery shells. There simply aren't enough trucks to carry them inland. Every soldier knows, without gas, even the mightiest army stops dead. General Eisenhower and his staff realize the danger. Victory in Europe won't be decided by who has more tanks, but by who can keep those tanks moving. And at this moment, the Allies are on the edge of running dry. Meanwhile, in makeshift camps across Normandy, soldiers try to improvise. Mechanics work without rest, stripping broken trucks for parts, turning wrecks into rolling machines again. They weld, patch, and repair under open skies, surrounded by the stench of oil and gunpowder. To them, every truck that rolls again could mean another day of progress or another day of survival. The roads are a nightmare. Bombed bridges force endless detours. Rain turns dirt paths into rivers of mud. Drivers navigate through darkness, dodging wrecks, enemy snipers, and friendly columns heading the wrong way. Many are just kids, barely 20, behind the wheel of a truck carrying thousands of gallons of gasoline, a single bullet away from disaster. In the command tents, the generals argue over priorities. The front needs fuel, but so do the airfields. The field hospitals need medicine, but the infantry is starving. Every gallon, every crate, every bullet must be counted and fought over. The enemy may be retreating, but logistics are collapsing. By July, frustration turns to desperation. Armies can't wait for slow convoys anymore. They are burning through fuel faster than it can be delivered. Patton's Third Army, advancing like lightning through France, threatens to stall not because of the Germans, but because its trucks can't reach him in time. This was the moment when the Allies realized the real war would be won by logistics. Somewhere among the chaos, a few men, mechanics, drivers, engineers, begin to wonder if there's another way. If maybe the problem isn't just the distance, but the design. Maybe the trucks themselves aren't built for this kind of war. And in that thought, simple, almost absurd, lies the spark of an idea that will soon change everything. An idea born from frustration, forged in grease and steel, and tested on the broken roads of France. The front lines may be moving east, but the heart of the Allied victory will be found here, among the convoys, the chaos, and the men who refuse to stop. Because after D-Day, the real fight was to keep moving. The fields of Normandy were littered with the carcasses of broken trucks. Wheels half buried in mud, engines cracked open, their loads abandoned. To most, they were wrecks. To Sergeant Bill Johnson, they were raw materials. By late summer 1944, he and his crew had turned their workshop into something between a scrapyard and a laboratory. Every day, trucks limped in from the front, each with a new kind of problem: burned clutches, broken axles, seized engines. And every night, the mechanics worked under flickering lamps, scavenging parts from one vehicle to save another. Out of necessity, they began to experiment. Johnson's goal was simple: build a truck that could go anywhere, survive anything, and be fixed by anyone. He started with the Army's workhorse, the GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6x6. On paper, it was strong. In reality, it was too fragile for France. The roads were gone, bridges destroyed, and every mile meant punishment for its suspension and drivetrain. So Johnson changed it. He replaced fragile parts with thicker, field-forged steel. He fitted larger tires salvaged from wrecked armored cars, improving traction in the endless mud. He modified the air intake system to prevent dust from choking the engine. And he added easy-access panels so mechanics could reach key parts without dismantling half the truck. To make it work, he had to break almost every Army rule. The official manuals said, "Don't modify." But manuals didn't drive through craters or dodge artillery shells. Men did, and those men needed something that worked, not something approved. Other units laughed when they first saw the Frankenstein trucks rolling out of Johnson's depot. They looked ugly: mismatched doors, welded fenders, stripped paint. But they were tough. They climbed muddy slopes where standard trucks bogged down. They carried double loads without breaking axles. They ran longer, burned cleaner, and could be fixed with nothing more than a wrench and determination. Word spread fast. Convoy drivers began asking for one of Johnson's monsters. Mechanics from nearby depots visited to learn how he'd done it. They copied his designs, took notes, and passed them along. Within weeks, dozens of field-modified trucks were rumbling across France. Unofficial, unregistered, but unstoppable. Soon, even high command began to notice. Reports came in describing exceptional performance from a handful of field-modified units. One major wrote that these trucks move where the road ends. Another called them the only thing keeping fuel moving to the front. Johnson's innovations, oversized tires, modular parts, field filters, began spreading across the Army. The design wasn't elegant, but it was effective. Proved that a truck didn't have to be perfect. It just had to survive. By September 1944, the Allies were running one of the largest logistical operations in history. Tens of thousands of trucks were needed to keep up with the advancing armies. And quietly, Johnson's ideas began shaping the fleet. Trucks built stronger, simpler, faster to repair. To the men who drove them, these weren't machines. They were lifelines. When you're hauling gasoline through enemy territory, when a single bullet can turn you into a fireball, you need a truck you can trust. And these, at last, could be trusted. One driver later recalled, "It didn't matter how bad the road got. Those trucks just kept moving. It was like they wanted to get us home." Johnson never patented a thing. He didn't even write his name on his blueprints. He wasn't thinking about history. He was thinking about survival and the next convoy heading out at dawn. He had built something for the impossible, and it worked. No one knew it yet, but those rough, battle-scarred trucks would soon form the backbone of a new kind of operation. A lifeline stretching hundreds of miles, feeding the front lines, and keeping the Allied war machine alive. They would call it the Red Ball Express. And it would prove that in war, the difference between victory and defeat can be a handful of mechanics, and a truck that refuses to die. In the summer of 1944, while generals argued over maps and supply lines, one Army mechanic worked in silence, surrounded by broken trucks and the smell of burning oil. His name wasn't famous. He wasn't an engineer or an officer, just a sergeant from the motor pool. But he saw something no one else did. Every day, Sergeant William Bill Johnson watched convoy trucks limp back from the front. Tires shredded, axles snapped, engines cooked. The war was moving faster than the machines designed to fight it. The Army's standard 2.5-ton truck, The GMC CCKW was reliable on paper, but out here in the torn-up roads of France, it was dying faster than it could be replaced. Johnson wasn't the kind of man to complain. He was the kind who fixed things or made them work when they weren't supposed to. He and his team of grease-covered mechanics spent endless nights welding, patching, and praying that their repairs would hold long enough for another run. But no matter how much they worked, the trucks kept breaking down. Then came the idea, small, almost foolish at first. What if the truck could be rebuilt for the roads they actually had, not the ones the engineers imagined? The Army had rules, of course. Trucks were built by design bureaus far from the battlefield, not by sergeants in muddy workshops. But Johnson didn't care. He began sketching a new version on a torn map. A truck with stronger suspension, bigger tires, reinforced filters to handle the dust, and quick access panels so repairs could be done in minutes instead of hours. A truck that could survive the hellish terrain of France and keep moving when everything else stopped. His commanding officer thought he was joking. "Johnson, we're here to fix trucks, not redesign them," the captain said. But Bill kept working. He scavenged spare parts from wrecks, experimented with different tire pressures, even cut down fenders to prevent mud clogging the wheels. Soldiers laughed at first, until they saw his prototype glide through mud where others sank. Word spread through the motor pool. Mechanics began copying his modifications. Soon, a small fleet of Johnson Specials was running supplies to the front. They looked ugly, patched together with mismatched panels and welded scars, but they worked. They didn't get stuck as often. They burned less fuel. And when they broke, they could be fixed in hours, not days. Still, to the higher-ups, Johnson's design was unauthorized. The Army bureaucracy hated improvisation. A colonel visiting the depot called it a waste of time and resources. He ordered the trucks repainted and standardized again. Johnson didn't argue. He just smiled and went back to work. Because he knew out here rules didn't win wars. Solutions did. By August, the front had stretched hundreds of miles eastward. The fuel situation was desperate. Every convoy truck mattered. And suddenly, those worthless field modifications began to catch attention. Commanders noticed that the trucks from Johnson's unit were making more deliveries, breaking down less, and surviving longer under fire. The higher-ups began to ask questions. What was different about these vehicles? Why were they outperforming the standard ones? Reports started climbing the chain of command, and soon, officers realized that the little mechanic from the motor pool might have stumbled onto something revolutionary. But Johnson never cared about recognition. To him, it wasn't about pride, it was about keeping his brothers alive. Every time he watched a convoy roll out, he knew that his idea might mean the difference between life and death for the men inside. He once said to a fellow mechanic, "If the brass thinks it's worthless, then it's probably just ahead of its time." And he was right. That worthless design, born out of frustration, necessity, and one man's stubborn belief that he could do better, would soon become the backbone of the most daring supply operation of the Second World War. An operation that would move faster, farther, and harder than anything before it. And it would prove that sometimes the craziest ideas are the ones that save a war. By August 1944, the Allied armies were advancing across France faster than anyone had dared to hope. From Normandy to Paris, German forces were in retreat. But behind the triumph, disaster was brewing. The front was moving almost 100 miles a week, far beyond the reach of the supply depots on the beaches. Fuel, ammunition, and food were stranded miles behind the lines. Tanks ran dry, soldiers went hungry, and artillery fell silent. Eisenhower's massive invasion force, the most powerful in history, was grinding to a halt. Not because of the enemy, but because of empty gas tanks. Something had to be done, and quickly. In late August, Allied command came up with a desperate plan. A non-stop truck convoy system that would keep fuel and supplies moving from Normandy to the front lines, day and night without pause. It would be a highway of motion, a lifeline carved through the chaos of war. They called it the Red Ball Express. The name came from railroad slang. Red Ball meant priority freight, the kind that had to get through no matter what, and that's exactly what this was. Within days, the roads from the beaches to Chartres and beyond were marked with red circles, signs that warned, Red Ball route, authorized vehicles only. More than 6,000 trucks were assigned to the operation, and nearly 75% of the drivers were African American soldiers. Men who, until then, had been restricted mostly to labor and support roles. Now, they were being handed one of the most critical missions of the entire war. They drove in long convoys, engines roaring, headlights off to avoid enemy aircraft. Each truck carried up to 2,000 gallons of fuel or tons of ammunition. The roads were narrow, muddy, and dangerous, lined with wrecks and dotted with signs reading, "Keep EM rolling." The convoys ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There was no rest, no rotation, no margin for error. Drivers slept in their cabs when they could, ate cold rations, and kept moving. If a truck broke down, it was pushed aside, its load transferred, and the line continued. The Red Ball never stopped. The organization behind it was astonishing. Traffic flowed in one direction on each route, east for loaded trucks, west for the empties returning. Military police directed thousands of vehicles. Mechanics set up mobile repair stations along the way, and fuel dumps were established every 25 miles. It was a living machine powered by men and steel. But it wasn't just a system, it was a symbol. For the African American drivers who risked their lives every day, the Red Ball Express was proof of their courage, skill, and determination. They faced not only enemy fire but also discrimination within their own army. Yet they delivered every single day the supplies that kept the Allied armies alive. They called themselves the Haulers of Victory, and they were right. Between August and November 1944, the Red Ball Express delivered over 400,000 tons of supplies across France. Fuel for Patton's tanks, ammunition for the front, rations for soldiers in the field, all carried on those battered trucks that never stopped moving. Drivers often raced through bombed-out towns and burning fields, their convoys stretching for miles. If they slowed down, they risked being strafed by German planes. Many painted slogans on their trucks: Hitler's Express, Hell on Wheels, No Sleep Till Berlin. They were proud, reckless, and relentless. And at the heart of it all were the trucks, the same rugged, modified 6x6 machines that Sergeant Johnson and his crew had rebuilt for the impossible. Their field-borne designs, once dismissed as worthless, were now the backbone of the greatest supply chain in military history. General Eisenhower later said, "The Red Ball Express was the lifeline of the Allied armies." He wasn't exaggerating. Without it, the push through France would have stalled. The liberation of Europe might have taken months longer or failed entirely. What began as a desperate improvisation had become a legend, a story of courage, ingenuity, and endurance. The Red Ball Express wasn't just a convoy of trucks. It was a symbol of human determination, of men who refused to stop, of engines that refused to die, and of a lifeline that stretched all the way to victory. And as the war rolled eastward, the rumble of those convoys echoed across France, carrying with it one message above all others: keep ing rolling, always keep 'em rolling. By September 1944, the rumble of engines echoed across France like a heartbeat. From Normandy's beaches to the front lines near Belgium, a single force kept the Allied armies alive: the endless convoys of the Red Ball Express. Day and night, over 6,000 trucks thundered down narrow, broken roads. Each carried the lifeblood of war, fuel, ammunition, food, spare parts. Without them, the advance would stop within days. With them, the Allies could move faster than the Germans could retreat. The trucks themselves were nothing special, at least not at first. Most were GMC CCKW 2.5-ton 6X6S, beaten and rebuilt, their olive drab paint chipped and scarred. But thanks to the field modifications pioneered by mechanics like Sergeant Bill Johnson, these machines had become tougher, more reliable, and ready for anything. Their drivers, most of them barely out of their teens, called them deuce and a half. They swore, cursed, and joked about them, but deep down they trusted them more than anything. Those trucks could take punishment no other vehicle could. Mud, craters, wrecked bridges, nothing stopped them for long. Each convoy was a test of endurance. Engines overheated, tires blew out, and transmissions burned under the strain. Drivers learned to fix their trucks on the move, changing belts, tightening bolts, even welding in the dark with flashlights and cigarette lighters. When a truck broke down beyond repair, its cargo was quickly transferred to the next one, and the convoy rolled on. The mission always came first. They drove with no headlights, guided only by the glow of the truck ahead. Dust and exhaust filled the air so thick it stung the eyes and burned the lungs. Rain turned the dirt roads into slick ribbons of mud. One wrong turn could send a truck sliding into a ditch or worse. And then there were the dangers beyond the road. German planes strafed convoys from the sky. Snipers targeted drivers. Mines and ambushes lurked along the route. Yet, every day the Red Ball Express kept moving. The drivers formed tight bonds, a brotherhood forged by sleepless nights, shared danger, and the roar of diesel engines. Most of them were African-American soldiers, often serving in segregated units, denied credit or recognition. But on the Red Ball route, none of that mattered. Out here, the only thing that counted was whether you could drive and survive. They gave their trucks names like Rolling Thunder, Hot Lips, Baby Doll, and Hitler's Nightmare. Some painted pin-up girls or slogans on the doors. Others tied good luck charms to the dashboards. Inside each cab was a small world of dust, noise, and determination. The convoys became living machines, thousands of parts moving in rhythm, controlled chaos flowing through the shattered landscape of France. Mechanics set up roadside repair depots, working around the clock. Fuel stations appeared every 25 miles. Military police directed traffic, keeping the lifeline open no matter the cost. And it worked. Patton's tanks roared eastward, fueled by the Red Ball Express. Artillery units received their shells. Rations reached hungry soldiers. Every frontline victory, every town liberated, was made possible by the trucks that never stopped. General Patton himself said, "My men can eat their belts, but my tanks gotta have gas." And that gas came from the drivers who risked their lives on the Red Ball routes, steering their overworked machines through fire and exhaustion. By October, the trucks had hauled more than 12 million gallons of fuel and hundreds of thousands of tons of supplies. They were battered, dented, and coated in mud, but they kept moving. For the soldiers at the front, hearing the distant rumble of those convoys was a sign of hope. It meant food was coming. Ammunition, fuel, life. The Red Ball trucks didn't carry glory, but they carried victory. And for every medal won at the front, there was a driver somewhere on that endless road, gripping the wheel, eyes burning from fatigue, who made it possible. These trucks weren't just machines of war. They were the veins through which the lifeblood of freedom flowed. And as long as their engines roared, the Allies kept advancing. They were, quite simply, the trucks that kept the war moving. The Red Ball Express wasn't powered by gasoline alone. It ran on something far stronger, the grit, endurance, and courage of the men behind the wheel. They were young, tired, and often forgotten by history, Many were African American soldiers, members of segregated service battalions who had volunteered or been assigned to drive the endless convoys across war-torn France. They weren't fighting with rifles or tanks, but with engines, gears, and pure willpower. And without them, the front would have starved. Every morning began in darkness. Engines roared to life before dawn, coughing smoke into the cold air. Drivers checked their loads, fuel drums, ammunition, rations, and painted white stars on windshields so friendly planes wouldn't mistake them for the enemy. Then they rolled out, one after another, stretching for miles down the bombed roads of Normandy. There were no maps, no GPS, and often no signs left standing. Drivers memorized routes or followed chalk markings scrawled on ruined walls. They trusted instinct and the red circle signs that marked the red ball route. Every turn was a gamble. A wrong move could mean ambush, a mine, or a crater too deep to climb out of. Sleep was a luxury. Some drivers went 48 hours without rest, their eyelids heavy, their minds foggy from exhaustion. They chewed coffee grounds or smoked constantly just to stay awake. One driver later recalled, "We didn't live by the clock. We lived by the engine sound. As long as it was running, we kept going." The roads were chaos. Convoys of hundreds of trucks barreled forward, wheels sliding in mud, dodging shell holes and wrecks. There was no stopping. If a truck broke down, it was pushed aside, and its load moved to another. To fall behind was to be left alone on a road where danger never slept. But the men didn't complain. They knew what they were carrying, the lifeblood of the Allied armies. Every drum of fuel meant one more tank could move, one more division could fight, one more day closer to victory. At night, the convoys drove blacked out. No headlights, no tail lamps, just the faint glow of the truck ahead. Drivers called it ghost driving. The only sounds were the hum of engines, the rattle of cargo, and the whispered prayers of men hoping they'd make it through. They faced constant threats. German aircraft strafed the roads. Snipers took aim from the treelines. Accidents were common. A single mistake could send a truck rolling into a ditch or bursting into flames. Yet they kept driving. Every mile was an act of faith. In the rare moments of rest, they laughed, sang, and swapped stories. Some played makeshift blues on harmonicas. Others wrote letters home they'd never have time to send. They shared cigarettes, food, and the strange sense of pride that came from knowing they were part of something bigger, something history would never fully understand. Despite segregation and the prejudice of the era, these men proved themselves indispensable. Their units, the 302nd, 514th, and many others, became legends among the troops. Frontline soldiers knew that when supplies arrived, it was thanks to those unseen heroes of the Red Ball Express. Mechanics, too, were part of this human engine. They worked without sleep, rebuilding trucks in the mud, often under fire. They carried spare engines in their own vehicles, ready to replace one in the field within hours. Every bolt tightened was another step toward victory. General Eisenhower later said, "The success of the Red Ball Express depended entirely on the men who drove it." And he was right. They weren't polished heroes in shining uniforms. They were covered in oil, dust, and sweat. But they kept the lifeline alive, and in doing so, they carried not just supplies but the weight of the Allied cause. When the convoys thundered past, townspeople would cheer. French children waved flags, calling them les camions de la liberté, the trucks of freedom. And that's exactly what they were, because behind every roaring engine, every spinning wheel, there was a man weary, determined, unbreakable, driving not just a truck, but history itself. They were the human engine behind the convoy, and their spirit kept the war moving. By the autumn of 1944, the Red Ball Express had become more than a supply line. It was the artery of the Allied war machine. From the beaches of Normandy to the fields of Belgium, its rumble signaled one thing: momentum. The Allies were finally moving faster than the Germans could retreat. Thanks to the endless convoys of trucks, Patton's Third Army surged across France at lightning speed. Fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts, everything that made war possible, flowed through those dusty roads like a river of steel. But behind the triumph, there was still chaos. The faster the Allies advanced, the longer their supply lines stretched. Bridges collapsed, roads vanished in mud, and German resistance stiffened. The Red Ball Express was asked to do the impossible: deliver twice as much, twice as far in half the time. Still, they did it. From sunrise to sunset, and often through the night, more than 12,000 men and 6,000 trucks kept moving, carrying over 400,000 tons of vital cargo in just 3 months. In the cab of every truck, the battle for Europe was personal. Drivers watched bombed-out villages blur past their windows. They saw civilians rebuilding their homes with shattered bricks and hope. They saw soldiers marching the other way to the front and knew their cargo might decide whether those men lived or died. Fuel was the greatest need. Patton's tanks, nicknamed the Hungry Beasts, drank up thousands of gallons a day. Without the Red Ball, his advance would have stopped cold. Every jerrycan delivered meant another mile of progress, another German position crushed beneath steel tracks. By September, the supply line had become a legend. Newsreels called it the Miracle Road. Commanders praised it as one of the greatest logistical achievements of the war. But the men behind it knew the truth: it wasn't a miracle. It was sweat, fear, and sheer human endurance. The work never slowed. Rain turned roads into rivers. Snow began to fall across northern France.
Tires spun helplessly in mud.
Trucks sank, engines froze, and drivers fought to stay awake. Still, they pressed on because the front couldn't wait. As Allied troops reached the German border, the Red Ball Express became the difference between momentum and stalemate. Every delay, every empty tank, every missing shell could cost lives. The drivers knew it, and they refused to fail. The convoy routes evolved, new ones were built, old ones closed. The original Red Ball system was phased out in November 1944, replaced by a network of routes that carried the same spirit forward. But its legacy was already sealed. The Red Ball Express had helped turn the tide of war in Europe. It transformed the impossible logistics of invasion into a seamless flow of power. It gave Patton, Montgomery, and Eisenhower the means to crush the Nazi war machine once and for all. In the grand strategy of generals, the Red Ball Express was often a footnote. But in the reality of the battlefield, it was the heartbeat of victory. Without it, the front lines would have stalled. With it, they surged forward, toward Paris, toward the Rhine, toward the end of tyranny itself. And yet, for the men who drove those endless miles, the reward wasn't medals or glory. It was the knowledge that they had done their part, that their hands on the wheel had helped shape history. When the guns finally fell silent, many of them returned home quietly, their names forgotten by the newspapers that once hailed their courage. But history remembers them in the roar of engines and the freedom that followed. Because in the end, it wasn't just the tanks or the planes that turned the tide in Europe. It was the steady rhythm of thousands of trucks, the determination of the men who drove them, and the belief that every mile mattered. From Normandy's beaches to the heart of Germany, the Red Ball Express carried more than supplies. It carried the momentum of liberation. And mile by mile, it helped turn the tide of the Second World War.